Thank you. Welcome back after the break. I'm going to give our three panelists a minute each to just summarize, but this time just looking forward into what can we do differently, how can we actually overcome the challenges that we have mentioned. Then after the three of them speak after Rosa, then I'll go straight to Judith, who is our online moderator, who has a question for particularly for South Africa, so that when South Africa comes on, they can actually respond to that question. Over to you, Mary.
Thank you, Professor. Well, as I was listening to my colleagues here, I thought the issue of support has to be addressed from the party, from the women movement, because as all of them said, the one movement with that, I think, which was really involved in support of women was CMD, and at some point, the Heinrich. Party involvement in support, financial support, issue of tribal and cronyism, and of course, never to ignore the slightest, the least detail. It might be one's undoing. I think it's also important that women are well prepared long before the electioneering period. Most of us voting without actually knowing what to expect. If you are well prepared before you engage, you'd also try and evaluate and get to understand how well prepared you are. Then you can be able to tackle any challenge along the way. Yes.
Thank you so much. And I feel that first, the most important thing is education. And I come from a constituency that is almost 95% illiterate. And most of the people are voter assisted. So manipulation of voting systems is very high there. So education is the most important one. Secondly, empowerment of women. Empowering the rural women and giving them the capacity and the opportunity to engage proper. Then capacity building of the youth. Youth always tend to support the women. So it is important at the village level and the rural level to do capacity building for youth. Then the other thing is to properly, from a region where, you know, we have a religion that plays, then we educate the masses against strong information. Because in my case, Islam is very key on women leadership. So they were using their culture in the mosques. So it is important to educate the community on women's leadership in Islam, because during the Prophet, women took key role and leadership positions during the time of the Prophet. So it is important for us to go out there and do a proper education to the women. Women are illiterate. They will only hear what a certain person who calls himself a sheikh, just misleading, giving misinformation of the religion. You know, Islam is not, it is in Arabic. So reading and writing Arabic becomes very difficult for the people, the pastoralist community in my region. So it is important that we change in trying to educate and giving proper civic education on women leadership in Islam. So those are some of the issues that I think if we address and give proper information and reach out properly to the people, so that we do not have brokers in between the women, the youth, and the candidate. Thank you.
Okay, Nyokabi, I'd like to say that the Constitution does offer us an opportunity of having independent candidates, but political parties are still the main avenue for women to join politics. And so I would like to encourage all women, be active in whatever political party you've chosen. I would go a step further and say that we also need to encourage these political parties that it's just not enough to hand over your tickets or your nomination certificates to women candidates. When you've decided to have a candidate, be it a man or a woman, let that candidate have the benefit of your popularity on the ground for you to realize full benefits. The women's movement must also be sincere. It must move away from lip service to actual support, even if there's no money. There's support in terms of mobilization, there's support in training, because when you just give lip service and on the ground you do the opposite, really you are not helping, you are not enhancing women participation in politics at all. Sophia has talked about civic education, and I think the women's movement has really been successful in the civic education amongst the youth and the women. But now the focus also needs to change to the churches like she's talking about Northeastern, and to the elders, because even if you don't come from Northeastern, a lot of our rural societies have elders governing the grassroots people. And those elders do have a strong say. So it doesn't matter whether we talk to youth, talk to women, when decisions or final decisions are made by these elders, more often than not, they are binding to the whole clan. So either the youth who've been educated keep off voting because they don't like what the elders are talking about, and by doing that, they're actually making their woman candidate lose. So let us continue with civic education, but let us refocus on the target of that civic education.
Thank you. So I'll just go ahead and highlight some of the questions that have come in from social media. You have addressed some of the issues, but I'll just go ahead and ask them. So one question is, so should we
Just
do
hold
a...
on. Judith, just focus on the questions that were addressed to South Africa. Then we
Okay.
go there, we'll come back to us later.
Okay.
Thank
So
you.
the question to South Africa was, is it this bad in South Africa? I guess the user is asking, can you share any experiences from South Africa?
And now we want to move over to South Africa. So Karen, take on the mic. Over to you. Thank you.
I think it will just be good if people shared different experiences from different countries.
So just repeat it again so that what had been asked for South Africa, they can address it. Then we hand over to Azina.
So the question was very basic. Is it this bad in South Africa? So we can use the same question and ask, is it this bad in Nigeria? Are there any shared experiences from women in politics?
So Azina, over to you. Over to you now. Is it this bad where you're sitting?
It's all the same thing here. It's just that the women we have in Nigeria, we have we have the Nigerian women are better off than South Africans because here we don't have all that decisions made by only men. Women in Nigeria have their own decision, and we also have women movements. So when we go out when we have a problem, like the challenge we're having now in Nigeria is the ASU strike, women in politics are up, and we have gone out to do one or two movements telling the president to call off the strike. So we have say in Nigeria, women in Nigeria have say in politics. We're not like other countries that they don't move around or do things without the men saying something or do decisions on themselves. Women here have decisions to decide. Like now, the governorship elections are coming up in Anambra State. Women are coming up to vie for the governorship elections. And I believe that now Nigeria has come up to a stage where women are 40 to 45% over the usual 10-15% we usually have in politics before. When our president came up, he gave us 5%, which we're now asking for 50%. I know that by 2015, in our elections coming up in Nigeria, we'll have up to 50%, over 50% men in politics. So in Nigeria, I would say we're coming up. Women are coming up in politics. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Duru Susan. I would like us, the women, to talk more on, based on the young women, not just the people at the high level or the political level, but also we the young ladies, young women who are aspiring to get into power or into politics. I want uh, I want you to like discuss or advise us on what to do to make us something or come out in life, because some of us here are young women and we are not yet there and we are aspiring to be there. So what is it we can do to move forward to also help the ones that are already there?
For me, I think this was raised earlier on social media. Is it just about getting numbers into politics or getting the right people into politics? Because we seem to keep asking for feminine voices and more women inside politics. But from the example of what is going on here in Nigeria, they don't seem to really make a lot of differences. Some of the most important positions in the country are held by women. The Minister for Petroleum is a woman. The Minister for Finance is a woman. The Minister for Aviation is a woman. Education is a woman. But in the end, these people do not necessarily defend women's women's issues. They don't really go out there for the women. A typical example in Parliament is that a few months ago, an issue came up on the minimum age of marriage for women in the country, and they were trying to change it to 18 years, but it did not pass. When that critical vote came up in Parliament, a lot of women elected not to vote. They abstained from voting. So it's almost just as bad as having a man there. So are we just trying to get numbers into politics, or should we change our concern to be getting the right women into politics?
Can we then try South Africa? I think those are important issues that were raised in Nigeria. They are sort of almost two differing positions, where one of your plenaries thought that Nigeria is way ahead, but then of course in the same room someone feeling that we need to go beyond numbers and just ask ourselves, when the women get there, how much influence do they have? And I think that's a question even some of our panelists did raise. Sometimes to tackle patriarchy, you need to ask ourselves, do numbers necessarily deal with it, and how, so that we get deeper into it. But I think we now want to go to South Africa and hear whether the situation is different. I think in Kenya we have painted a picture that is a reality, and that the women here are being very, very open and honest about their experiences. Let's hear how it is in South Africa. Over to you, Karen.
Apparently it was the mic. So just to repeat some of the things I said before, I just want to acknowledge that because I'm not an expert on the subject, it seems to be that many of the people who are experts on this were not available today. I'll do a short presentation that draws very heavily on a paper called Making Women's Representation in Parliament Count. And it was written by Lisa Vetten, Lindiwe Makunga, and Alexandra Leistang. This is it. And I'll make the link available online on Twitter as soon as I'm done. I'm also going to rely on a report of a meeting that convened earlier this year. It was a meeting between young women from all the major political parties in South Africa, as well as women from trade unions. And it was a conversation that was conducted under Chatham House rules. And because we wanted it to be a very frank and open conversation, thus far the report from that meeting has not been made public. And I will have to check with the participants before we do, but should it be okay, that will be also posted on the website in the next couple of days. And lastly, as I said before, I will also rely on the vociferous participation of all my colleagues and comrades in the room. So after these acknowledgements, let me begin. And because South Africa has a proportional representation system, PR system, a lot of what I will say will touch on the role of political parties. And as you all would know, South Africa is a kind of poster child when it comes to the representation of women in decision-making structures. So globally, the averages for women in parliament is around 18%. In South Africa, it's more than 44%. And moreover, like what we heard in Nigeria, women occupy ministerial positions that are not stereotypical positions. It is not only a woman's ministry that is headed by a woman, but key portfolios, those such as international affairs, until recently energy, mineral resources, education, these are all headed by women. And women, in fact, are a regular feature of political and public life in South Africa. And it is the ruling party, the African National Congress, that is almost exclusively responsible for that great participation and for that gain. The country has no legislative quotas. So it is, in fact, the ANC's commitment to 50-50 internal quotas and its electoral strength in the country that leads to this result in the high levels of women's participation. As we heard on Monday in Shireen Hassim's keynote address, the ANC's commitment to quotas was not a gift to women. So those mentions we heard about the women's movement and the role they play is very important. The ANC's commitment to parity and representation arose from the demands and the mass organization and mobilization of the Women's National Coalition, which campaigned in the early 90s during South Africa's transition from apartheid. That really, they are the group that really campaigned to advance women gains, and they worked to ensure that the transition from apartheid to democracy also bore fruit for women. And many key leaders in the Women's National Coalition were also ANC members, and their demands were integrated into the party's policies and manifestos. But once quotas and the principle of equal representation was entrenched in the ANC, the party has been proud of it, and it is one of the flagship achievements it holds up, I would say. Over the past 2 decades, the party has reiterated and reinforced its commitment. And as such, women's representation in parliament has steadily increased since 1994, from around 35% when the ANC first came in, to the 44% we see today. But we're gathering here today to ask, what have these numbers meant to gender relations within political parties, and what have they meant to society as a whole? And here, I want to pause and say that in this conversation, the ANC will to some extent be the victim of its own progressiveness and electoral power. It's going to be in the center of this discussion and this conversation because they are the most powerful political party and force in South Africa. They have the greatest number of women in its ranks, and they are the ruling party. So to reiterate what one of the Kenyan participants said, many women are in the right party, so to speak. And they provide a lot of very rich material for discussion. And in fact, without them, we'd probably be having a very different conversation altogether. But that does not mean that other parties should be let off the hook. And I will get back to that point later. So back to our question of what have these numbers, what has this 44% in parliament meant to gender relations within political parties and society as a whole? So, and here I'll again just want to reiterate my reliance on this paper. The ANC's policies and programs certainly acknowledge the marginalization of women in society, so the feminization of poverty and the unequal burden placed on women by care work is certainly a feature of the ANC's policies and discourse. But despite this, it seems that the party's focus on achieving gender equality is focused on numbers. So when we advance, when we celebrate women's advance in society, and when the ANC puts those gains forward, we look at the tables produced by the International Parliamentary Union of the numbers of women in parliaments, not by progress on the Gender Gap Index or the Gender Development Index, which Shireen Hassim highlighted as so important in her address on Monday. In its recognition that women do bear a disproportionate burden of poverty, the ANC's response is in its general development policies. So it assumes that general policies on unemployment, on HIV, on poverty will benefit women. Some programs will benefit men and women equally, or are supposed to benefit men and women equally. Others try to place a slightly greater emphasis on women. And I haven't counted, I haven't done the maths, but these certainly are smaller than the scale of the problems. And there's something funny with my mic there if I'm making funny faces. It's because of that. So while there are many women in the party in strong positions, the party's approach ends with the assumption that numbers will translate into policies that integrate women's perspectives, and that generalized development programs will balance the scales of the inequality between men and women. But as we know, it's never so straightforward. So, for example, in 2009, the ANC introduced a Ministry for Women, Children and Persons with Disabilities. And this was a move that was seen as regressive by many feminists rather than progressive. The ministry, as most others in the world, is underfunded and lacks political power. And as we heard yesterday, it creates the impression that something is being done when in fact their focus seems to be on events and once-off campaigns. In 2013, the president announced, after many years of lobbying, that special courts for sexual violence would be reintroduced. However, no funding was provided for these in the budget. So although there's a lot of rhetoric and some policies and efforts to address the imbalances, these don't seem to be nearly enough. And certainly, we cannot say that the ANC is gender blind because of those efforts to address the symptoms of women's inequality. But at the same time, and this is actually the key point that I want to make and that this paper makes, is that it does not challenge the logic of the naturalization of gender stereotypes and roles, and there are no efforts that aim to proactively dismantle patriarchal power structures or the power of men over women in society. In fact, as we're speaking, the ANC is pushing legislation through Parliament that would further subjugate women in rural areas to discriminatory power structures. This is called the Traditional Courts Bill. And more than that, or in line with that, the party does not seem to see, or even aspire to see, its female leaders as feminist agents of change. In fact, it very explicitly sees all its members as representatives of the values that it upholds, one of which is gender equality. But again, as this paper argues, when everyone is responsible for something, then no one actually does anything. And no one is held accountable or tasked with proactively ensuring that the ANC's policies would lead to better outcomes on the gender gap index or in society. And especially, I think a point was made earlier on by the Kenyan discussants. I think developments like the Traditional Courts Bill really make it question, I guess, to what extent the voices of grassroots women actually travel up the chain of command and make their ways up to the decision-making positions and places. Many rural women have come out very strongly against the Traditional Courts Bill, and yet it is something that the party seems to be committed to in the run-up to the next elections. And so there's a kind of contradiction of the parties that arises, because on the one hand, the party is hugely committed to the 50-50 principle, and at the same time, it pushes legislation like the Traditional Courts Bill. And that also raises the question of, you know, when the ANC celebrates, or when parties celebrate that they are committed to gender equality, what kind of gender equality are we talking about? And I think that's a question that, you know, should be posed to political actors as well as political parties that we're talking about today. It's not good enough to just pay the lip service, as somebody said. I think we actually need to unearth and question what kind of gender equality. In our conversation with young women from political parties, it was clearly shown or clearly reflected that across the political spectrum in South Africa's political parties, there is a lack of resources and political commitments to structures and processes that are meant to empower women within political organizations. So, for example, when there's meant to be money for a women's congress, suddenly that money disappears. There isn't enough money for women's representative bodies. There's difficulty getting support for gender equity issues because they're seen as radical or secondary. and that resistance to prioritizing gender equity comes from both men and women in political parties. With the exception of the ANC, again, across the political spectrum, many political organizations, even on the left, have resisted 50-50 principles. And while policies regarding women's participation have improved, policies on sexual harassment within those very same organizations have not. And all this points to a real, I think, misunderstanding of what gender equality is, what gender equity is, and what it entails. So many equate it with seeing women as CEOs or, back to the numbers game and what gender equity issues are. And there's no recognition of patriarchy and the systemic nature of the problems that are faced. So what kind of reality have numbers given us? In the case of the ANC, it seems that on the surface, the party embraces gender equality, but deep down, it subverts it in some ways. The woman who should be responsible for taking gender equality further in the party, the ANC Women's League, the Ministry for Women, Children, Persons with Disabilities, the chairpersons of the portfolio committees on women, children, and persons with disabilities, on the whole, do not seem able to affect the party's attitude towards women and patriarchy at a deeper level. As agents of change, they have demonstrated different levels of commitment and effectiveness. So the portfolio committee, for instance, have been relentless at pushing for stronger responses to South Africa's epidemic to gender-based violence. The minister has come out against a traditional courts bill, but seems to have been sidelined in her resistance. I don't think the ANC's Women's League has substantively weighed in or engaged in the debate. And here again, I'll ask my colleagues in the room to weigh in. And back to the other parties. So as for the other parties, they have shown even less commitment to gender equality than the ANC. And even less wave their commitment to gender equality as a flag, as something to be proud of. So as I said, this has been a conversation centered about the ANC because of the rich material that it provides. And indeed, without the ANC, we'd be having a totally different conversation. We wouldn't be at a place where we even had access. And this is not something that we should take for granted. But we should also be asking, to what extent has the main opposition demonstrated its commitment to transforming unequal gender relations? And here, I don't think I'm the only one who has focused on the ANC, but I think that because of the rich material the ANC provides, there hasn't been that much analysis of the kind of lack of commitment or lack of support, lack of real progress that other parties have contributed on this front. As far as I know, although there are other powerful women in other South African political parties, none of them have supported quotas or parity principles. And here I think COPE may be an exception, but I'm not 100% sure. In 2009, for example, Helen Zille, the leader of the main opposition, appointed an all-white male cabinet in the province which the DA rules. When challenged on the matter, she reverted to the argument of competency. So according to her, in the whole of the Western Cape, there were no other women, white or black, or even black men for that matter, in the DA or the Western Cape, who were competent enough to take on leadership positions in the province. And so I think there's a real challenge for us to look at other political parties in as much emphasis as we placed on the ANC and what kind of role they play in advancing gender equality. I think we also need to ask questions about, when parties put forward notions of gender equality, what kind of gender equality are they talking about? And lastly, I think one of the most important points that this paper makes is, do political parties, when they put women in positions of power, do they expect them to be feminist agents of change? Do they expect them and support them to really dismantle and challenge the power structures, the patriarchal structures that exist? And I think these are questions that we should look at regardless of where we are, in our ranking on the IPU table, whether we are number 4 or number 1 or number 77 or whatever number it is, because it really makes a difference to, as Azinar said, what kind of woman do we want in politics and leadership positions? And what kind of outcomes and deliverables do we expect them to give us? So thanks for that.